Reese, thank you very much for the really contextualizing of the whole shift that is taking place with technology becoming a major part of children's daily lives. I want to pick up, just build up on that, just hearing what Reese very clearly, I think, set out the terrain uh, that is giving rise to big questions about the whole public good in education. And I think it resonates very much with what Katina was saying as well. How do we go about creating structures and conversations where we start treating certain aspects of our civic responsibility as a kind of a public good to be nurtured, to be promoted, and also to be protected? And just hearing what Rees was saying, and you're right to talk about and a whole series of work coming, and I'll probably extend that to Neil Selwyn as well. There's a lot of work, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, starting to take seriously the impact of educational technology, and not simply education technology in the context of schools, but also the educational uses of technology. And this starts not only at school level, but also before children even get to the doorsteps of the school. And there's been some serious work being done, particularly in the UK, the Digital Futures Commission, and everyone is starting to have a second look at the prevalence of educational technology in schools, in colleges, and in universities. And I think I just want to pick up one point, and because I think it resonates very much with this whole idea of commodification and the way data generated by individuals is being optimized from the heading of innovation, but in reality, it's actually creating a kind of a servitude, which brings me back to the title of the talk, the paper that I put forward. We don't get education. With the emergence of AI-driven processes and processes for data-driven decision making, I just step back to think, what is education going to look like in, say, 2020, 2030, 2040? And for the children that actually come into the classroom, will the classroom be very similar to what we currently have now, or would it completely change where there will be no human whatsoever? So usual science fiction images of the future of technology and education, they always bring in this aspect of robots. And it made me stand back to say, but what's the whole purpose of education? Why are we creating a process where children actually go through the process of education? And rather than looking at new studies, some of the answers are already found in the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. And that was the focus point about conceptualizing children's rights and the implications of children's rights, which I think, Rees, you very nicely captured the importance of children's rights. Where do children fit in the conversation when we have an environment where technology is increasingly being integrated into every aspect of the teaching and learning cycle? So I just want to highlight probably about 3 or 4 points, and I think that should suffice. I produced a statement paper. It's just littered with a lot of academic citations, which I don't think will be appropriate for the forum here. But I want to highlight a study done by the United Nations Children's Education Fund, and this was done early this year. And they surveyed the national AI strategies of over 104 countries. And what they noticed, and I'll just list some of the findings, which is quite grim reading. But I'll end like Katina on a very optimistic note if I can, and like you, Liz, as well. I think the first finding was that most national AI strategies only make a cursory mention of children and their specific needs. And that is warning bells in terms of inclusivity, diversity, children with special needs. This is somehow missing in quite a lot of national conversations about children and their place in the educational context. So while there are instances of strategies adopting a kind of human-centered or societal approach, there's really insufficient acknowledgement or real evidence-based studies to say, how is AI actually affecting children within the context of the school or settings where learning takes place? The second finding, I think, worth highlighting from the study done by the UNICEF was a very little attention is being given to actually safeguarding the rights of children in an algorithmic oriented economy and society. Kristina, you very, very clearly and captured, I think, that the human side of what algorithms and data-driven decision-making does. But yet within the context of the edtech sector, I think the blurring between the commercial interests and the public good in education, I think technology is somehow portrayed as a kind of a solution to the kind of problems. And the question that one asks when we say, what's the whole purpose of education? What does technology actually add to educating children? So there are a lot of mentions of upholding children's rights, but they all tend to be focused on only improving access to. Missing, I think, is equally important is what's the whole purpose of education, as well as a relational dimension of education. And before we convene this panel, we talked about how remote learning, one of the things that we notice is, well, screen time all the time is not really a kind of a healthy prospect, not only for adults, but for children as well. So there's very little evidence, I think, at this point in time, highlighting how and what the impacts of using AI-driven processes, technology-mediated practices, how that has an impact, not only in terms of access to education, but also in terms of all the other rights. So inclusivity, the conditions under which learning takes place, and all the associated rights as well, in addition to the usual focus on, and very important, data management and privacy. And I think literacy skills becomes also an equally important aspect that I think insufficient investment within the school technological infrastructure. And the emphasis has been largely on preparing children to work in an AI-centric economy with the benefit, with the assumption, I think, that the benefits of AI will be available to all children. But we know the reality in most schools that we have in our countries, that investment is sorely lacking, and children are not even given the very basics of the tools to go through the whole life cycle of education. So in summary, I think the emerging picture has been that children's rights are either given little consideration, overlooked, or eroded by the design, development, and use of educational technologies. And here I probably want to emphasize the way technology is problematized and sold to educational institutions. But it's easy to overlook the fact that these private corporations that are making valuable, getting invaluable access to the school environment are also businesses, and optimizing data becomes the kind of focal point. And the pandemic has highlighted the way technologies have, of course, enabled teaching and learning to take place. But I think there's been very little evidence of their impact on other rights and needs. And just the final point, children are not really a homogeneous group. And if technology is a solution, and the question that I think really needs a second look is, what is the problem it is intended to solve when dealing with children with access or special educational needs? So what might an agenda for a children's rights model look like? And I think I want to pick up what Reese, I think, nicely ended her excellent presentation. The United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child is also overseen by a body, the Committee on the Right of the Child, and they produced a very important set of guidance in early this year, known as General Comment number 25. And I think it's identified, I think, 6 things that are probably worth thinking about in terms of actually bringing forward an agenda for education where children become the focal point. I think the first one is a money question. Invest in critical technological infrastructures in schools and educational settings. Secondly, to develop evidence-based policies that are commensurate with the core values and principles of the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child. Yes, even though it was formulated in a pre-digital environment, many of its core values and principles will continue to be relevant. But the AI question, the AI classroom, I think it still raises a very important question. Have you really had the time and the energy and the conversation about how to create diverse ecologies of learning and teaching so that the inequities that currently exist in education can either be arrested or actually eradicated completely? Then the fourth one, it would be to start to utilize processes for engaging children in the design, development, and evaluation of educational technologies and programs. So Katina, I like the idea of design thinking, and I thought within the context of digital literacy for children and teachers, age where children actually take part in design thinking, because ultimately it's their education that is at stake here. And finally, we can't avoid the role of the law in this area. And Reese, you mentioned about the code of conduct, standard setting for data management and procurement, and more importantly, enforcement. I think those are the 6 kind of drivers, I think, for actually starting to better position, I think, conversations about what children need when we talk about education in schools.